left the room. "How proud that man is," said Mr. Hale, a little annoyed that Higgins had refused his offer of help. "Yes, but how strong and honest he is too," said Margaret. The next morning a letter arrived from Edith. It was full of affection, like its writer, and described Edith's little boy, who had been born a few weeks earlier. Edith was very insistent that Margaret and her mother should come and stay with her in Corfu for at least 3 months. She did not ask Mr. Hale, whom she blamed for taking the family away from Helston. Margaret would have loved to go to Corfu and live Edith's life, just for 1 day. She was not yet 20, but she felt so old, and she thought that it might make her feel young again. Her mother came in, and they were laughing about Edith's letter when Mr. Thornton appeared, with another basket of fruit for Mrs. Hale. He had come because of his great need to see Margaret again. But after he had glanced in her direction, he bowed coldly to her and turned away. He presented the fruit to Mrs. Hale and talked kindly to her for a few minutes. He did not look at Margaret, and when she spoke seemed not to hear her, although his next remark showed that he had. His behaviour was not polite at all, but it was clear to Margaret that the reason why he was behaving badly was because he was very hurt. He left with one last cold, offended look at her, unaware that his behaviour was making Margaret think about him more than ever before. She regretted hurting him so deeply, and would have been very happy to return to their previous relationship. She now realised that they had in fact been friends. Mr. Thornton, as he walked downstairs, was proud of the way he had forced himself to see her and not reveal his feelings. He thought that he hated seeing the woman who had treated him so cruelly the previous day. But he was very wrong. End of CD 2. Chapter 9. Mrs. Hale. Mrs. Thornton came to see Mrs. Hale the next morning. Mrs. Hale was much worse. A sudden change had taken place during the night, and now, with her grey face and hollow cheeks, she looked as if death could not be far away. Mrs. Thornton had not believed that Mrs. Hale was really ill, and she had only come because her son had insisted. But now that the reality of the younger woman's death was clear, she softened immediately. Mrs. Hale lay still, then with a great effort reached for her visitor's hand and whispered, "My child will be without a mother in a strange place. If I die, will you... You wish me to be your daughter's friend?" Mrs. Hale could not speak, but she pressed her visitor's hand. Mrs. Thornton sighed. It was difficult to say that she would be kind to Margaret, whom she disliked so much. "I am not the kind of person who shows affection, but I will be a true friend to Miss Hale. If she is in difficulty and comes to me for help, I will do everything I can for her. I also promise that if I ever see her doing something that I think is wrong, I will tell her, just as if she were my own daughter." There was a long pause. Mrs. Hale felt that this promise did not include everything, and she did not really understand why. But perhaps this was because she was very ill. "I thank you," she said. "I shall never see you again in this world, but I thank you for your promise of kindness to my child." "Not kindness," said Mrs. Thornton, but fortunately Mrs. Hale did not hear her. Mrs. Thornton held the dying woman's hand for a moment and left the house without seeing anyone. Meanwhile, Margaret and Dixon were discussing how to keep Frederick's visit a secret from anyone except the family. A letter was expected any day, and he would certainly arrive soon afterwards. They decided that if Dixon needed help in the kitchen, they would ask Mary Higgins. They knew that if she met Frederick, who would be known as Mr. Dickinson, she would not be interested in finding out more about him. Poor Margaret. All that day she had to ignore her own feelings and look after her father, who sat in the sitting room with his head in his arms. From time to time Mrs. Hale suffered terrible pain, but in the evening she slept, and Dixon sat with her. Darkness came. Margaret did not want to leave her father, and the lamps had not been lit. She was sitting at the window looking out at the street, when suddenly the doorbell rang. She jumped up and went down to open the door. A tall man was standing there, but she could not see his face. "Is this Mr. Hales?" he said clearly. Margaret trembled all over, then whispered, "Frederick," and held out her arms to him. They kissed each other. "Mother, is she alive?" "She is very, very ill, but she is alive." "Thank God. Did you receive my letter?" "No, but we knew you would come." Margaret took Frederick to Mr. Hale's study and lit a lamp. Now she could see that his face was quite brown from the sun and that his eyes were very blue and bright. They did not exchange a word, but there was an immediate understanding between them, and Margaret's heart was much lighter as she went upstairs. It took Mr. Hale some time to understand that Frederick had come, and when he did, he began to cry like a child. Leaning on Margaret's arm, he went down to the study, and Margaret left him with Frederick. She ran upstairs and cried bitterly. It was the first time she had allowed herself this relief for days. Frederick had come. He was safe. She could hardly believe it. Feeling much better, she went into the kitchen, made the fire, lit lamps, and prepared food for the traveller. She came into the study carrying the dishes like a servant, and Frederick immediately jumped up to take them from her. It was typical of his loving behaviour over the next few days. The brother and sister put some plates on the table, saying little, their hands touching, their eyes speaking to each other. They heard Dixon moving about in the kitchen, and Margaret went to tell her the news. Mrs. Hale was awake, but they decided that they would not tell her that Frederick had arrived until after Dr. Donaldson's visit in the morning. He would be able to tell them how to prepare her for seeing her son. Frederick and his father sat in the study talking, while Margaret said nothing but listened quietly. It was a huge source of strength to her that her brother had come. She examined his appearance carefully and liked it. He had delicate features and a friendly, cheerful expression that could change suddenly and become very passionate. She could see that he understood his father's character and his weaknesses. He knew exactly how to talk to him and make him feel better. Perhaps because she was older now, the brother and sister felt closer to each other than ever before. When Mrs. Hale saw Frederick the next morning, she seemed to improve. She sat with his hand in hers and would not let go of it even while she slept. "I am very selfish," she said, "but it will not be for long." Frederick bent down and kissed the hand that imprisoned his. Kind Dr. Donaldson told Margaret that her mother did not have many hours to live, but Frederick could not believe it. That night, however, Mrs. Hale became unconscious and died before morning. Frederick, who had been so strong until then, now sobbed so violently that Margaret and Dixon feared that their next-door neighbours would hear him. Margaret sat with her father in her mother's room. He did not speak, but from time to time stroked his wife's face, making a soft sound like an animal with her young. He ignored Margaret completely, and her heart ached for him so much that she could not think of her own loss at all. Morning came, and Margaret did her household duties, her eyes almost blinded with tears. Her father and brother were so full of grief that she felt she had to look after them. She made breakfast and lit a fire, but the contrast between its bright cheerfulness and her own thoughts made her kneel by the sofa and cry into the cushions. Dixon found her there and spoke gently to her, and the old servant's kindness made her feel a little better. At breakfast, Mr. Hale did not seem to know where he was, and Frederick burst into tears. Afterwards, when Margaret tried to discuss the arrangements for the funeral, Mr. Hale understood almost nothing, but asked Margaret to write to his friend Mr. Bell in Oxford and tell him the news. Towards evening, Dixon told Margaret that she did not feel it was safe for Frederick to stay in Milton. She explained that while she was shopping, she had met a young man called Leonards, whose family she had known in Southampton. He was a sailor and had been on the Russell at the same time as Frederick, although Dixon did not know if he had taken part in the mutiny. She had recognized Leonards, and they had had a short conversation. He had asked about Frederick and talked about the mutiny, saying that Frederick would be hanged if he was caught. He said that £100 reward had been offered for catching Frederick, and suggested that Dixon could help to trap him, and that they would then share the reward. Dixon had never liked or trusted Leonards. Her story made Margaret feel very uncomfortable. "Have you told Frederick?" she asked. "No, but I've told your father, and he thinks that Frederick must leave." The two women felt the same, but it was very hard for Margaret, just when Frederick had returned to his family. She was sitting by the fire and thinking about this when Frederick came in. "How tired you look, Margaret," he said. "You have been looking after everybody and no one has looked after you. Lie on the sofa. There is nothing for you to do." Margaret gladly went to lie down, and the two began to talk in low tones. Margaret told Frederick Dixon's story, and he looked shocked. "Leonards was the worst sailor on the ship, and a really nasty fellow. All the sailors who had the right ideas were angry with the captain, but Leonards was always trying to please him, and he's here, in Milton. If he knew I was here, he'd tell the police without a doubt." Mr. Hale heard what they were saying and came towards them eager and trembling. He took Frederick's hands in his. "My boy, you must go. It is very bad, but you must. You have done all you could. You have been a comfort to your mother." "Perhaps I should stay and let them take me to court," said Frederick thoughtfully. "No, you must go." Frederick changed the subject. "Do you know, I was in my bedroom this afternoon and the doorbell rang, so I waited for some time until I thought the visitor had left. Then I opened the door and saw a great powerful fellow going down the stairs." "It was Mr. Thornton," said Mr. Hale. "Mr. Thornton?" said Margaret, a little surprised. "I thought you meant someone of a different class, not a gentleman." "He looked like someone who worked in a shop," said Frederick carelessly. "But it seems he's a manufacturer." Margaret was silent, remembering how, before she knew Mr. Thornton well, she had thought of him in just the same way. She wanted to make Frederick understand what kind of person Mr. Thornton was, but she could not think what to say. Mr. Hale continued. He came to offer to help us, but I could not see him. I told Dixon to ask if he wished to see you, Margaret. Margaret was silent, and after some moments Frederick said, It is painful to think I can never thank those who have shown you kindness. But you could both come to Spain. I have a good job there and a promise of promotion. Margaret, I told you about Dolores Barber. She is not yet 18, but I hope that in a year she will be my wife. You would love her if you knew her, I am sure. If you came, you would have so many friends. No more changes for me, said Mr. Hale. Moving here has cost me my wife. I am staying here. Oh, Frederick, I am so glad you have someone to love and care for you out there, said Margaret. I know you took part in the mutiny, but for Dolores' sake, perhaps you should try and prove that the most serious accusations are not true. A discussion began. Frederick did not know if it was possible to find the witnesses, all of them sailors, who could explain why the mutiny had happened. I don't think the attempt would be successful, he said doubtfully. But could we not at least try to find them? There is a friend of mine, a lawyer, a very clever man, who would be happy to help you. Mr. Henry Lennox's father. Margaret blushed when she said this. I think it is a good idea, said Mr. Hale. But Frederick must not stay in England just to see him. Listen to my plan, said Margaret. Frederick, you could take the night train to London tomorrow and leave a note from me for Mr. Lennox at his home the following day. Then you could take the next boat from London. Mr. Hale and Frederick immediately agreed to the plan, and Frederick wrote down a list of sailors' names. Margaret wrote the note to Lennox with Frederick looking over her shoulder, and she did not have time to worry about whether she was using the right words after their last difficult meeting. The family sat together in the sitting room all the next day. Mr. Hale only spoke when his children asked him questions. Frederick was now ashamed that he had allowed his grief to overcome him, and although his sorrow was very real, he did not speak about it again. Margaret was suffering more now and spent a lot of the time crying. Mr. Hale and Margaret wanted to make sure that Frederick was safely on the night train to London, and they decided that Margaret would accompany him to Outwood Station. It was bitterly painful for Mr. Hale to say goodbye to his son, and Margaret hurried Frederick into the carriage that was taking them there. They arrived at the station quite early and went to walk in a field next to the station. They were talking about their father when a horse rider passed slowly by. The evening sun was shining directly on Margaret's face, and she bowed to the rider, who bowed stiffly back. "Who is that?" asked Frederick. "Mr. Thornton. You saw him before, you know," said Margaret, looking worried. By now it was time to return to the station, and Frederick went to buy his ticket. They were walking down the railway platform when they heard the sound of the approaching train. Just then a porter came up to them. It was clear that he was drunk, and he pushed Margaret to one side, then seized Frederick by his collar. "Your name is Hale, I believe." When Frederick heard this, he immediately pushed the man away, and the porter fell off the platform, a distance of 3 or 4 feet. "Run! Run!" whispered Margaret urgently. "The train is here!" It was Leonard's, wasn't it? A carriage door was open, and Frederick jumped into the train. As he leant out to say goodbye, the train started to leave, and Margaret was left standing alone. She felt so sick and faint that she went into the waiting room to sit down. When she felt a little better, she began to wonder if the man had been seriously hurt. And although she was frightened to do this, she went back to the platform to look for him. No one was there. She was trembling so much that she felt she could not walk home along the dark, lonely road, and she decided to take the next train back. But supposing Leonards recognized her as Frederick's companion? Fortunately, when she went to get her ticket, there were only a few railway officials there, talking loudly to one another.
"So, Leonards has been drinking," said one of them. "He came in about 5 minutes ago with a story about how he'd fallen off the platform. He wanted to borrow some money to go to London by the next train. I refused and he's gone off somewhere." "To have another drink, I guess," said another man.
Frightened that Leonards would return, Margaret hid in the waiting room until the next train came. She was helped into the carriage by a porter whose face she did not dare to look at until the train started moving. Then she saw that it was not Leonards. Chapter 10. A Police Inspector. Home seemed unnaturally calm after Margaret's frightening experience at the station. Mary Higgins had come to work in the kitchen. Mr. Hale did nothing except sit in his chair in a kind of waking dream, and Margaret decided not to tell him about the incident at the station, as things had ended well. Although it was possible that Leonards would borrow money to go to London, it was unlikely that he would find Frederick there. Margaret decided not to worry about something she could do nothing to prevent, as in a day or two Frederick would be safely out of England. Mr. Hale had wanted Mr. Bell to come to the funeral, but his old friend sent an affectionate letter saying that, unfortunately, he was unwell and could not come, although he promised to visit in September. Mr. Hale decided to invite Mr. Thornton instead, but Margaret, who feared the idea of seeing Mr. Thornton again, begged her father not to ask him, and in the end he agreed. The morning of the funeral arrived. Margaret had slept badly and was shocked to receive a letter from Frederick saying that Mr. Lennox was away and would not be back for another 2 days. Consequently, Frederick had decided to stay in London until his return. His decision made Margaret very anxious. If Leonards had gone to London, he now had more time to find Frederick. But she could not think about this for long. Her father was almost too weak to get into the funeral carriage, and he needed all Margaret's attention and support. When they arrived at the church for the funeral service, Margaret saw that Nicholas Higgins and Mary were there. She would have liked to talk to them, but felt unable to leave her father. Mr. Hale seemed to see nothing. He mechanically repeated the words of the clergyman, and at the end of the service he had to be led away as if he were blind. Dixon covered her face with her handkerchief and was so absorbed in her grief that she did not notice that people were leaving until someone spoke to her. It was Mr. Thornton. He had been standing at the back of the crowd with his head bent, and no one had recognized him. "I'm sorry, but can you tell me how Mr. Hale is, and Miss Hale too?" "Of course, sir. Mr. Hale is very distressed. Miss Hale seems better than you would expect." Mr. Thornton would have preferred to hear that Margaret was really suffering. He was selfish enough to hope that his great love might be able to comfort her. But he was also disturbed by the memory of what he had seen at Outwood Station. She had been with such a handsome young man, and had seemed so relaxed and confident with him. What was she doing with a man at that late hour, so far away from home? All sorts of ideas went through his mind. Perhaps the reason why she was able to bear her grief was because of her love for this stranger. Mr. Thornton's face grew pale when he heard Dixon's answer, and he said coldly, "I suppose I may call, and see Mr. Hale, I mean." He spoke as if he did not care at all, but although he hated Margaret at times, he desperately wanted to see her. For some reason, Dixon never told Margaret about her meeting with Mr. Thornton, and so Margaret never learnt that he had attended her poor mother's funeral. Although to an observer, Margaret did not seem to feel much grief, her pain was in reality so great that sometimes she wanted to scream. What made her and her father feel even worse was that 2 days had passed and there was still no letter from Frederick. Mr. Hale was walking up and down the sitting room, desperate with worry, when Dixon opened the door to announce Mr. Thornton. He took Mr. Hale's hands and held them for a minute or two, his face and eyes showing more sympathy than could be put into words. Then he turned to Margaret. She did not appear better than you would expect. There was a look of great suffering on her face, and her eyes were red from crying. He had intended to greet her coldly, but he could not help going to her and speaking about her mother's death so gently that Margaret could not hide her emotion. She picked up her sewing and sat down. Mr. Thornton's heart beat fast, and for the moment he completely forgot about Outwood Station. Just then Dixon came in and said, "Miss Hale, there is someone to see you." She looked so upset that Margaret immediately thought that something had happened to Frederick. Feeling sick, she followed Dixon out of the room. "It's a police inspector. He's in the study." "Did he name—" "No, he just asked if he could speak to you." "Make sure father does not come down." The inspector was a little surprised by Margaret's haughty manner as she entered the study. She showed neither surprise nor curiosity, but stood waiting for him to speak.
"I'm sorry, madam, but I need to ask you a few questions. A man called Leonards has died at the hospital. He had an accident, a fall, at Outwood Station, between 5 and 6 last Thursday evening. The fall was not serious, but because of a previous illness and the man's alcohol habit, it killed him."
Margaret's large eyes opened a little, but otherwise she showed no emotion at all. She said, "Well, go on."
"There will have to be an inquest," said the inspector. He explained that a porter at the station had seen Leonards rudely push a young lady who was on the platform. She was with a companion who had then pushed Leonards off the edge of the platform. The porter said that he had not thought any more about the matter, because the platform was not high and he had seen Leonards get up and run down the platform. "A grocer's assistant, who was on the platform, thinks that the woman may have been you, madam," said the inspector, watching Margaret carefully.
"I was not there," said Margaret expressionlessly. The inspector bowed, but did not speak. The grocer's assistant had not been sure that it was her, and he thought that she was probably telling the truth.
"Then, madam, you can assure me that you were not the companion of the gentleman who pushed Leonards off the platform?"
"I was not there," said Margaret, slowly and heavily. Margaret's exact repetition of her words made the inspector suspicious. Frowning, he said, "I may have to call on you again this evening and ask you to appear at the inquest. You may need to give an alibi." When Margaret's haughty expression did not change, the inspector decided that the grocer's assistant was probably wrong.
"It is unlikely, madam, that this will happen. I hope you will forgive me for doing my duty."
Margaret bowed her head as the inspector walked towards the door. She opened it for him and accompanied him to the front door. Then she returned to the study, locked the door, and fainted. Mr. Thornton and Mr. Hale talked for some time. Margaret's father found Mr. Thornton wonderfully kind and comforting, and trusted him enough to tell him his most secret feelings. At the end of their conversation, both men felt much closer to each other. Mr. Thornton left the house and was walking along the street when he met the police inspector, who was called Watson. They knew one another, and Mr. Thornton had helped Watson get his first job. They greeted each other in a friendly way, and the police inspector said, "I believe you were the magistrate who went to the hospital last night to hear the statement of a man called Leonards. He died several hours later." "Yes, I'm afraid he was a drunken fellow," said Mr. Thornton. "Well, sir, his death is connected with somebody in the house I saw you coming out of just now. Mr. Hale's house, I believe." "Yes," said Mr. Thornton, looking at the inspector with sudden interest. "What about it?" "There is some evidence that Miss Hale was the companion of the gentleman who pushed Leonards off the platform. A grocer's assistant who was there said that he recognised her, but the young lady denies that she was there at the time." "Miss Hale denies she was there?" said Mr. Thornton. "Yes, she denied it twice. Since you are the magistrate who saw Leonards, it seems a good idea to ask for your advice." "She denies having been at the station," said Mr. Thornton in a low tone. He paused and then said, "You are quite right to ask for my advice. Don't do anything until you have seen me again. It's now 3 o'clock. Come to my factory at 4. "I will, sir," said Watson. The two men separated, and Mr. Thornton hurried to the factory, went to his office, and locked the door. There he thought about every detail of his last 2 meetings with Margaret. She had looked so full of grief when he had seen her an hour ago that he had forgotten his suspicions. Now they were awakened again. Perhaps she was not as pure as she seemed. The thought came and then went immediately. But she had lied to the inspector, when she was usually so truthful. What did she fear would be revealed if she told the truth? Mr. Thornton almost pitied her for the shame she must have felt to lie in this way. Suddenly he jumped up. As a magistrate, he could prevent the inquest. Then Margaret would not have to give an alibi. Even if she was in love with another man, he could still save her from being shamed in public. He might despise her for lying, but he could still protect her. He left his office and went out for about half an hour. When he returned, he wrote 2 lines on a piece of paper, which he put in an envelope. He instructed a clerk to give the note to Mr. Watson when he came at 4 o'clock. The note contained these words: "There will be no inquest as the medical evidence shows that there is no reason for one. Do not investigate further. The decision is my responsibility." "Well," thought Watson, "that means I don't have to do a difficult job. None of my witnesses seemed certain of anything except the young woman." That evening, Watson visited the Hales' house again. Margaret had had a terrible day. She had decided to say nothing to either Dixon or her father about her meeting with the inspector, but lay on the sofa looking ill, only speaking when spoken to. She tried to smile when her father looked anxiously at her, but only succeeded in sighing. At 9 o'clock, the inspector had still not come, and Mr. Hale said good night and went to bed. Margaret was preparing to do the same when the doorbell rang. She answered the door herself and led the inspector into the study. "You are late," she said, hardly daring to breathe. "Well?"
"I'm sorry to have given you unnecessary trouble, madam. They've decided not to have the inquest."
"So there will be no more inquiries," said Margaret.
"I believe I've got Mr. Thornton's note with me," said the inspector.
"Mr. Thornton's?" said Margaret.
"Yes, he's a magistrate." "Ah, here it is."
Margaret took it, but felt so confused that she could not understand what was written on the note. She held it in her hand and pretended to read it.
"I met Mr. Thornton this morning, just as he was coming out of this house," the inspector continued. "He's an old friend of mine, and he's also the magistrate who saw Leonard's last night, so I explained my problem to him."
Margaret sighed deeply. She was afraid of what she might hear and wished the man would go. She forced herself to speak. "Thank you for calling. It is very late." He held out his hand for the note, and she gave it back to him, then said, "The writing is small and I could not read it. Could you read it to me?" He read it aloud to her. "You told Mr. Thornton I was not there."
"Oh, of course, madam. I'm sorry to have troubled you. The young man seemed so sure at first, and now he says he was never sure at all. Good night, madam."
She rang the bell, and Dixon came to show the inspector out. As the servant returned up the passage, Margaret passed her. "It is all right," she said, without looking at her, and before Dixon could say anything, she ran upstairs to her bedroom and locked the door. Then she threw herself on her bed, feeling much too exhausted to do anything but lie motionless. After half an hour, she felt a little better and sat up. Her first feeling was one of huge relief. There would be no inquest, and so there was no danger that Frederick would be identified as her companion at the station. She then started to try and remember every word that the inspector had said about Mr. Thornton. When had the inspector seen him? What had Mr. Thornton said? What had he done? What were the exact words of his note? Until she could remember every word in the note, her mind refused to go further. But the facts were clear enough. Mr. Thornton had seen her close to Outwood Station last Thursday night, and had been told that she had denied being there. Margaret did not tell herself that there was a good excuse for her lies, nor did she imagine that Mr. Thornton would be suspicious of the fact that she was with a handsome young man. There was only one thing that concerned her. The fact was that Mr. Thornton now saw her as a liar. She was a liar, and he knew it, and must despise her for it. "Oh, Frederick," Margaret cried, "what a price I have paid for saving you!" She fell asleep with these thoughts going round and round in her mind. When she woke the next morning and the full memory of the situation returned to her, another thought came to her. It was because Mr. Thornton had learnt about her denial that he had decided there would be no inquest. He had done this so that she would not have to give an alibi at the inquest. But if this were true, Margaret did not feel at all grateful, as it meant that he realised that she had done something very wrong. In that case, Margaret thought that he must feel great contempt for her. She hated the thought that he had saved her, and wondered what Leonards had told him. Perhaps he had told Mr. Thornton about Frederick, or perhaps Mr. Thornton had heard the story from Mr. Bell. If so, then the mill owner had lied to save Mr. Hale's son, who had come to see his dying mother. In that case, then she should be grateful to him. But she feared that he did not know the real facts, and only saw her as a liar who must be saved. Margaret had always seen herself as superior to Mr. Thornton. She was in a different position now, and felt very unhappy about it. She did not ask herself why it mattered so much to her that Mr. Thornton should despise her. Dixon knocked at the door and came in. "Here's something that will make you feel better. A letter from your brother." Margaret thanked Dixon, but waited until she was alone before she opened the letter. The first thing that she noticed was that the letter had been sent 2 days ago. It should have arrived the day before. Frederick wrote that he had seen Mr. Lennox, who had said that it was very dangerous indeed for him to have returned to England. But after some discussion, the lawyer had also agreed that it would be worthwhile finding witnesses who could tell the real story of what happened on the Russell. Then perhaps the trial could take place, and the court would decide that Frederick was innocent. "It seemed to me, little sister," wrote Frederick, "that your letter made him very anxious to help me. He's an intelligent fellow. I am on a boat that will leave in 5 minutes. What an escape that was! Don't tell anyone I came to England, not even the Shaws." Margaret could not have been more thankful that Frederick was safe. But the date on the letter told her that he had left England 30 hours ago. There had been no need for her to lie to the inspector and make Mr. Thornton despise her. But why did she keep thinking about Mr. Thornton? Why did she care so much about his opinion of her? What were these strong feelings that made her tremble and hide her face in the pillow? She dressed and took the letter to her father, who she knew would not pay any attention to Frederick's words about the incident at the station. Mr. Hale was very relieved that his son was safe, but was concerned about Margaret, who seemed very distressed. "Poor child, poor child," he said, and made her lie down on the sofa and cover herself with a shawl. Through the day he tried hard to be cheerful, and Margaret was grateful to him. Mr. Thornton had said that he might call that evening with a book for Mr. Hale, but Margaret knew he would not come, since he would be afraid of meeting her so soon after what had happened. She realized now that it was wrong of her to feel ungrateful. Oh, but she was grateful. It was a pleasure to her to realize how much she respected him. The book from Mr. Thornton arrived that evening with a kind note inside. But as Margaret had guessed, he did not come himself. By now, she felt very confused. She felt great shame when she thought about meeting him again, but at the same time she very much wanted to see him. But Mr. Thornton did not come the next day, nor the day after that. This surprised and upset Mr. Hale, as Mr. Thornton had promised that he would call. Every time that the doorbell rang, both father and daughter hoped that it was the mill owner, but he did not come. Chapter 11. A Woman in Love. What most upset Mr. Thornton about Margaret's lie was that it concerned an attractive young man. He could not forget that Margaret had looked at this man as if she loved him. And then there was the fact that she had been with him in the evening when it was growing dark, at some distance from home. The fact that she had lied showed that she had done something wrong and needed to hide it. Mr. Thornton decided that Margaret, who was usually so truthful, was prepared to do something wrong because of her love for this stranger. This thought made him fiercely jealous and very bad-tempered. At home he was more than usually silent and annoyed his mother by walking up and down the sitting room without speaking. "Can you stop? Can you sit down for a moment?" said his mother crossly one evening. "I have something to tell you." He sat down and Mrs. Thornton continued. "Betsy is so upset by her lover's death that she cannot work for us any more and is going to leave us." "Her lover was Leonard's, you told me." "Yes, and she has told me that Miss Hale was with the young man who pushed Leonard's off the platform. She was walking in a field with him, apparently, quite late in the evening." "I don't see why that should concern us." "I am glad to hear you say so," said Mrs. Thornton, looking pleased. "But I made a promise to her mother that if her daughter did something wrong, I would speak to her about it." "I don't see any harm in what she did that evening," said Mr. Thornton, getting up and turning his face away. "You would not have approved if Fanny had done it." "Miss Hale and Fanny are very different. Miss Hale always has a good reason for doing something, unlike Fanny." "How kind you are about your sister. Miss Hale's behaviour is clear to me now. The man she was with is her lover." Mr. Thornton turned round to look at his mother, his face very grey, and said, "Yes, Mother, I do believe he is her lover." The pain of admitting this was almost too much to bear, and he turned away from her, then immediately turned round again and said, "Mother, he is her lover, but she may need help and advice. I know that something is wrong. She is in difficulty. Go to her and advise her." "What do you mean, John?" said his mother, really shocked. "What do you know?" He did not answer, and after some moments she said, "I will go to her and speak to her as if she were Fanny and had gone walking with a young man in the evening. Then I shall have kept my promise to her mother and done my duty." "You cannot talk to her in that way. She is much too proud." "I can, and I will." "Well," Mr. Thornton said, going to the door, "don't tell me any more about it. I can't bear to think about it." "Oh, Margaret, could you not have loved me?" he said fiercely to himself as he locked himself in his office. "I may not be a gentleman, but I would never have made you lie for me." Margaret was sitting alone, writing a letter to Edith, when Dixon opened the door to announce Mrs. Thornton. Margaret was so gentle and polite that Mrs. Thornton found it very difficult to say her carefully prepared words. It was only as she stood up to leave that she coughed and said, "Miss Hale, I promised your mother that if you behaved badly in any way, I would do my duty and give you my opinion of your behaviour." Margaret blushed. She thought that Mrs. Thornton was going to speak to her about the lie she had told, and that Mr. Thornton had asked her to do this. Mrs. Thornton continued. "At first, when I heard that you had been seen walking with a gentleman in the evening as far away from home as Outwood Station, I could hardly believe it. But my son confirmed the story. It was not at all wise of you, Miss Hale. The story could harm your reputation." Margaret's eyes flashed fire. So Mrs. Thornton had not come to talk to her about the fact that she had lied. Instead, Mrs. Thornton wanted to discuss her behaviour when she hardly knew her at all. It was too rude. Seeing how angry Margaret was, Mrs. Thornton became angry too. For your mother's sake, I felt it was my duty to talk to you about your behaviour. For my mother's sake, exclaimed Margaret tearfully. She never wished you to insult me, I am sure. Insult you, Miss Hale? Yes, madam, said Margaret more steadily. What do you know about me that would make you suspect— Oh, she said, covering her face with her hands. I know now. Mr. Thornton has told you. No, Miss Hale, said Mrs. Thornton. Mr. Thornton has told me nothing. Listen, young lady, and you will understand what kind of man you have refused. This Milton manufacturer, whom you despise so much, told me that he believed that you were in difficulties because of a gentleman, and that you needed some advice. He admitted that you had been seen with a gentleman at Outwood Station, but apart from that, he has said nothing. Margaret was still crying, with her face hidden in her hands, and Mrs. Thornton softened and said, Perhaps there are circumstances that can explain your behaviour. Margaret considered what to say, but could not find a good explanation. Finally, she said in a low voice, I can give you no explanation. I have done wrong, but not in the way you think. I think Mr. Thornton judges me more kindly than you. It is the last time I shall try to give you advice, said Mrs. Thornton stiffly. I only came because your mother asked me to. I never liked the fact that my son cared for you. You did not appear to be good enough for him. But your behaviour during the riot showed that you cared for him too. When the servants and workers started talking about you, I felt that it was right for him to ask you to marry him. But when he came to see you, your feelings had changed. I told him that I thought that perhaps your lover— What must you think of me, madam? Said Margaret, throwing back her head haughtily. Please do not continue. I will not try to explain my actions. You must allow me to leave. And she left the room with the noiseless grace of a princess. Mrs. Thornton was not particularly annoyed by Margaret's behaviour. She did not care enough about her for that. The fact that her words had upset Margaret pleased her, as it showed that Margaret cared about what people thought of her. I like to see a girl get angry at the idea of being talked about, thought Mrs. Thornton. It shows that she has the right kind of pride. After she had left Mrs. Thornton, Margaret went to her room and made herself recall every word they had spoken. Then she said sadly to herself, Her words can't really affect me because I was not with a lover. I was with Frederick. But it's awful knowing that she thinks this about me. She doesn't know my real sin, that I lied. He never told her. I should have known he would not. Then a new thought came to her. He too must think poor Frederick is my lover. I understand now. It's bad enough that he knows that I lied, but he also believes that someone else cares for me and that I— Oh dear, why do I care about what he thinks? I don't know why, but I am very miserable. He misunderstands me so completely and I feel terrible. She jumped up. No, I will not examine my own feelings. It would be useless. If I live to be an old woman, Perhaps I'll sit by the fire and think about the life I might have had. There must be many women who have made the same mistake and only realize when it's too late. I was so rude to him that day, but I did not understand my feelings then. I don't even know when they began. I must be strong. It will be difficult, but when I see him, I will be very calm and quiet. But I may not see him. He has not called for some days. That would be worst of all. To try and forget about her feelings, Margaret decided to visit the Higgins' next-door neighbours, the Bouchers. But when she arrived at their house, a neighbour told her that Mrs. Boucher was dying. A doctor had been called, and the children were being looked after by neighbours. Margaret decided that the best thing she could do was call on the Higgins. She went next door and found Nicholas Higgins playing with the 3 youngest Boucher children. "Have you seen Mr. Thornton?" she asked Nicholas.
"Yes," said Nicholas angrily.
"He refused you," said Margaret sorrowfully.
"Of course he did. I knew he would."
"I am sorry I asked you. You told him I sent you?"
"I don't know if I mentioned your name. I said a woman advised me to ask him."
"I am disappointed in Mr. Thornton," said Margaret. There was a slight noise behind her. Margaret turned round and saw Mr. Thornton standing at the door, with a look of angry surprise on his face. In one quick movement, Margaret stood up and left without saying a word. As she hurried to Mrs. Boucher's, she heard the door shut loudly behind her. Mr. Thornton had come to see Higgins because, although he tried to hide it, there was a part of him that was very soft. He had refused Higgins because he had heard reports that the man was a troublemaker. But afterwards he had learnt that Higgins had waited 5 hours to see him, and he was impressed by the man's patience. He had also learnt that the worker's story about the Boucher family was true. He had come to Higgins's house to offer him work. Higgins was a proud man. There was a long pause before he accepted the offer, but he did, and the 2 men shook hands. "Was that the woman who advised you to ask me for work?" asked Mr. Thornton. Higgins told him that it was. Mr. Thornton frowned, disliking the idea that Margaret might think he had given Higgins work because of her, when he was only doing what was right. As Mr. Thornton left, Margaret came out of the Boucher's house. She did not see him, and he followed her, admiring her tall, graceful figure. Then he suddenly felt very jealous. He wanted to speak to her and see how she would behave after all that had happened. Also, he had heard her last words and wanted her to know that he had given Higgins work. He came up to her, and she looked at him in surprise. "You do not need to be disappointed in me, Miss Hale. I have given Higgins work." "I am glad," said Margaret coldly. There was a silence, and then Mr. Thornton said, "Miss Hale, have you no explanation for the lie that you told? You must know what it has made me think." Margaret said nothing. She was wondering whether she could give some kind of an explanation and still be loyal to Frederick. "No," said Mr. Thornton. "I will ask no more questions. Believe me, your secret is safe with me. But please be careful. I am now only speaking as a friend of your father." "I am aware of that," said Margaret, forcing herself to appear uninterested. "But the secret is about another person, and I cannot explain it without harming him." "I have no desire to know the gentleman's secrets," said Mr. Thornton angrily. "My only interest in you is as a friend. That is all now. You believe me, Miss Hale?" Yes, said Margaret, quietly and sadly.
Then really, I don't see why we should continue walking together. I thought perhaps that you might have something to say, but I see that we mean nothing to each other. If you are quite certain that I no longer have any strong feelings for you, then I wish you good afternoon. And he walked away.
What can he mean? Wondered Margaret. He talks as if I thought he still cared about me, when I know he cannot. His mother will have said all those cruel things about me, but I will try my best not to care about him. Surely I can control this wild, miserable feeling that tempted me to betray Frederick, just so that he would respect me again. I must be strong. I must. Several months passed, and although Mr. Thornton occasionally came for lessons with Mr. Hale, he never asked to see Margaret. After her conversation in the street with Mr. Thornton, Margaret's moods varied strangely. But a letter from Edith made her feel a little less miserable, as her cousin talked about returning to Harley Street in about 6 months and inviting her to stay. Life became quiet and boring. Margaret looked after the house and her father, visited Mary Higgins, and helped to care for the Boucher children after the death of their mother. Then, in September, as he had promised, Mr. Bell came to visit. Mr. Hale's old friend liked Margaret enormously, and they immediately became very good friends. "I must say, I think your opinions are very old-fashioned," said Margaret jokingly to Mr. Bell one afternoon. "Listen to this daughter of yours, Hale. What has life in Milton done to her? She has become a Democrat." "You say that just because I believe that commerce is good for the country." "I don't like this rushing around,